On the morning of Tuesday, July 13th, 1993, a middle-aged nurse named Sharon Dempsey hurried down the hallway of the Meharry Hubbard Hospital, which was in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. And as she went down the hallway, Sharon checked in every single hospital room because she was searching for a patient that kept disappearing from her room. When Sharon reached the end of the hallway, she looked into the last room, and there, inside, was the woman she was looking for. Her name was Mildred Lancaster. She was 69 years old, and she was sweeping the floor of another patient's room with a broom that Sharon knew she had taken from the custodian's cart. Sharon walked in, and she politely asked Mildred, what are you doing here? And Mildred turned to her and just said, oh, she was just doing her job. But she wasn't really doing her job. Mildred had been admitted to the hospital 2 days earlier because she was having stomach pain, but she was also suffering from extreme bouts of confusion. At this, Sharon, the nurse, just sort of sighed and kind of rolled her eyes because, obviously this was not Mildred's job. Mildred was a patient. She had been admitted to the hospital 2 days earlier, primarily because she was having stomach pain, but she also suffered from severe bouts of confusion, which is something she was witnessing right here. Her family had told doctors that, Mildred had spent most of her life being a housekeeper. And so when she would get confused, which, they saw plenty of times, she often would sort of default to thinking that she was back to being a housekeeper, even though, she was home or clearly not working. She would think she was working. And so when Mildred began demonstrating this kind of bizarre, disoriented behavior, there was some consideration to actually just physically restraining Mildred inside of her room to keep her from vanishing and, going and thinking she was a housekeeper somewhere. She could get into trouble or get hurt. However, Mildred was this very sweet and gentle woman who, it was just hard to forcibly restrain inside of her room. And so instead, the medical team decided that we're just gonna have to deal with the fact that periodically she's gonna, think she's at work and it might walk out of her room and go start cleaning somewhere. And so we need to keep a close eye on her and keep her safe and just deal with her stomach pain and sort of manage her disorientation. And so in this moment, Sharon, the nurse, who's just found Mildred once again cleaning some room she was not supposed to be in, she just, followed their protocol and went in and kind of gently told Mildred, like, okay, put the broom down, come with me. And, Mildred listened and she led Mildred back to her room and Sharon continued going about her day. A couple of days later, and Sharon was doing her regular rounds through the hospital. And as she did, she went into Mildred's room and once again, she saw the room was empty. Now, Sharon was actually just kind of annoyed at this point. She wasn't really concerned because by this point, Mildred had done this, had, become disoriented and left to go clean or something so many times by this point that it was just kind of a hassle. But, Sharon just followed protocol and quickly left the room and began walking along the floor looking for Mildred so she could bring her back. But after searching the floor, she didn't find Mildred. And so after checking the whole floor again, but this time much more thoroughly, looking in every closet, every supply area, really searching the area and still not finding her, that's when Sharon began to panic. She began going to other nurses and doctors and asking them, have you seen Mildred? And remember, at this point, the whole floor is aware of what's going on with Mildred, but nobody had seen her, so nobody knew where she was. And so Sharon ultimately went and spoke to the higher-ups at the hospital and informed them what was going on here. And in turn, they launched this huge search all across the hospital, both inside and outside, to just go find Mildred and get her back. And while the search is ongoing, Sharon was walking around trying to be helpful because, she was somebody that worked closely with Mildred and had a sense of where she might go. And she was telling folks to go to messy areas because Mildred, when she would get confused, would basically go clean areas she deemed messy. And so go to parts of the hospital that might look messy. And so people were doing that. But this hospital, it was huge. It was 11 stories tall. And there were lots of areas that appeared messy. And so it just seemed like a kind of overwhelming task to quickly search this massive property for Mildred. And then on top of that, making it even harder to find Mildred was the fact that the hospital didn't have security cameras. So they couldn't just pull up the footage and see if maybe Mildred had walked outside or something. After about an hour of the search going on, when still they had not found Mildred and people were starting to wonder, like, are we even gonna find her at all? It was at that point that something new and really concerning happened. Sharon called Mildred's cousin to let her and the rest of Mildred's family know that Mildred was missing and that this time it was actually pretty serious that they hadn't found her. But as Sharon is breaking this news to the the cousin stops her and says, well, wait a minute, I think I know what's going on here. Because apparently, a few hours earlier, the cousin had gone to the hospital to visit Mildred. And when they got there and spoke to the receptionist looked up Mildred to see what room she was in. And on their system, it showed that Mildred had checked out of the hospital that morning. So she was not there. And so, of course, this big search for Mildred was not going to find her because she wasn't at the hospital. But this really made no sense to Sharon. I mean, it did logically make sense that if she checked out, that would explain why she wasn't here. But Mildred should not have been allowed to check out of the hospital. She still definitely was not well. Not just her confusion, but also the stomach pain she was having. Like, she was still totally sick and should not have been discharged. But, the cousin was adamant that they actually left the hospital because they told them, Mildred's not here. There's no one to go visit. She's gone. She checked out. And so Sharon hung up with the cousin and quickly ran down the hall to go talk to the receptionist to see if it was actually true that Mildred had been discharged. And when the receptionist looked it up, sure enough, it was true. Mildred had checked out. And so at this point, Sharon, she could not believe what she was hearing. This didn't make sense. And so Sharon, kind of not knowing what to do next, she walked away from the receptionist and she just walked over to the window that looked out to the front of the hospital. And she was just standing there wondering what she should do. And as she was standing there, she was just looking outside kind of absentmindedly. And she saw all these cars whizzing by, all these busy streets out there. And she suddenly had this thought, well, wait a minute, what if Mildred, in her confused state, went to the front desk and somehow talked her way out and got discharged and has now wandered out into the streets? And what if she's gotten hit by a car or something? This could be an emergency. I have to do something. And so Sharon's first thought was, I got to call the police. And so not long after this, after Sharon did call the authorities, the police arrived at the hospital, and they arrived along with search dogs. And one of the search dogs almost immediately picked up Mildred's scent by one of the front doors of the hospital. And then the dog led its handler down the street, which seemed to confirm that Mildred really had left the hospital. And so officers would search a full square mile around the hospital, and they even got a helicopter to begin flying overhead. And the search went on for days. But nobody found Mildred. There was no sign of her. She just disappeared. Until almost 2 weeks later. On Wednesday, July 28th, so 13 days after Mildred went missing, a security guard walked into a construction site on his daily patrol. And at the very edge of this site, he noticed there was a long, thin hole in the ground that was about 5 feet deep that had been dug to lay some pipework. But when the security guard just happened to walk over and look down into the hole, he gasped because he saw Mildred. It would turn out, on the day Mildred disappeared, she did become very confused, and she believed she was once again a housekeeper, and she went out, left her room to go do some work. And so Mildred just began wandering around the hospital for quite a while, and surprisingly, nobody stopped her, even though she had left the floor that she was supposed to be on. But she was just such a pleasant person and so nice that she just kind of passed by people and nobody said anything. And after wandering around for quite some time and going in and out of different places and up and down flights of stairs, she eventually found this construction site. And to her, it was not a construction site. Instead, it was this horribly messy area that needed to be cleaned because there was pieces of wood and plastic and debris everywhere. And so she just began to clean. And after a while, she had picked up quite a bit of debris and she had basically straightened the whole area out. But as she walked around towards the back of the site, she did not see a hole in the ground and she fell inside. And because Mildred was just very disoriented, she likely didn't understand that she had, fallen into a hole and needs to climb out again. And so in this dark space, this dark confined space, she would have just continued to feel more and more disoriented and maybe didn't even attempt to climb out. But however it happened, she just stayed in that hole and remained undetected for days until she just eventually died. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case is that Mildred actually never left the hospital. That construction site was on the 10th floor of the hospital. Mildred had just kind of meandered her way up to that floor, and that floor was being renovated. That was the construction site. And she had fallen in that hole. Then you have all these people that are searching the hospital looking for her, and they searched that construction site, but they didn't look down into this little hole. And Mildred, assuming she was alive when they were up there, didn't have the wherewithal to call out for help. She was confused and just stayed quiet in that hole, and so she was never found. Today, it's still not known why Mildred was listed as having been discharged on the day she went missing, because she was not discharged. Some people say maybe it was added into the system by mistake, or perhaps it was just a glitch in the system, but however it happened, it was just an anomaly. And then also the police dog that found Mildred's scent that took the authorities away from the hospital, that's also anomalous. We don't know how or why that happened. Ultimately, Mildred's family would sue the hospital for $13 million in damages, but eventually they dropped the case. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. You know that feeling when you know you're about to do something like a bad habit and you just can't stop yourself? You see it happening and you know you're not supposed to, but it's like you can't stop. And eventually, if this continues to happen to you and you don't make a change, you start looking internal and saying like, what's wrong with me? Even though the reality is there's nothing wrong with you. This is part of being human. When I was in the military, I definitely developed some bad habits. And when I transitioned back to being a civilian in 2017, a lot of those bad habits followed. And I definitely found myself in that cycle of like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I stop? Well, let me just tell you, this cycle, these patterns I'm describing, they're not random. The reason this happens is because you have some sort of unresolved issue or issues, and you really need to talk to somebody about it. This is where BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp makes it really easy to access credentialed therapists. BetterHelp also accepts both HSA and FSA cards, making it even easier to prioritize your mental health. In 2024 alone, over 137,000 people used their HSA or FSA benefits for therapy through BetterHelp. So be sure to use yours before they expire. You've been fighting these patterns alone for long enough. Maybe it's time someone actually helped you understand them. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen to get 10% off your first month. On the night of January 12, 1964, a police sergeant named Neil Johnson entered a small apartment in Los Angeles County, California, along with a team of other officers. And basically, as soon as they walked inside this apartment, they were hit with this blast of hot air and also a just terrible smell. And very quickly, Sergeant Johnson and the others recognized where the smell was coming from, because on the couch was a man who was clearly dead and decomposing. So Sergeant Johnson and the rest of the police officers had been called here by this building's landlord. The landlord had gotten complaints from some other tenants about this awful smell coming from this specific apartment. So they'd come to check it out and, mystery solved. There was a dead person in here. And based on the information they'd already gotten from the landlord about who was renting this apartment, the police already suspected that they knew exactly who this man was. The tenant of this apartment, the sole tenant, was a 38-year-old man named Eugene Meadows. And he'd actually just moved into this apartment only 6 days ago. And on top of, living in this new apartment, Eugene also was just kind of new to the area. He'd moved here from about 8 hours away for a new job. So realistically, there was a good chance he didn't really know anybody in the area. Sergeant Johnson and a few other officers walked over to the couch to take a closer look at Eugene's body. And pretty much right away, they could tell two things. One, it was pretty clear Eugene had not died recently. He had died maybe at least a couple of days ago, so he'd been sitting here for some time. And the other thing they noticed was very clearly there was a bullet hole in the back of his head. But as Sergeant Johnson began looking around the apartment for more clues, he realized that the bullet hole really didn't make any sense. Because first of all, the whole apartment was very neat and very clean. There was no sign of a robbery or a struggle or a break-in. Plus, the landlord had told Sergeant Johnson that when he had first come to check on Eugene after the initial reports of a bad smell coming from his apartment, the landlord had found that the apartment door was locked from the inside. And also he found that all the windows were closed and locked as well, which meant if Eugene was murdered, The only way that was possible would be if the killer, after shooting Eugene, left and then locked the door behind them, which meant they would have had a key, which sort of suggested that, maybe they knew Eugene, or maybe they just took the key off of him. But, Eugene is new to the area, and so it just seems sort of like a difficult theory to come up with of who would have killed him and left the scene looking this way. But the alternative to murder, perhaps that Eugene took his own life, also didn't really seem possible. Because number one, they couldn't find a gun. There was no gun in the apartment. Certainly not a gun that was near Eugene. If he would have taken his own life, the gun should have been nearby, and it wasn't. And they searched the whole apartment. There was no gun. So Sergeant Johnson and the entire team were pretty much baffled at this point. It just didn't seem to make sense how this guy could have died. And so instead of trying to, piece it all together now, they just transferred Eugene's body to the local coroner for an autopsy, hoping that the autopsy would give them more answers and allow them to understand what happened here. However, when the coroner examined Eugene's body, things actually only got more strange, because the coroner could not find a bullet inside of Eugene's head or anywhere in his body. And there wasn't an exit wound. So imagine if you get shot, the bullet goes into you, unless there's an exit wound where that bullet can exit you, the bullet will remain inside your body. And so Eugene has one hole in his head, a hole in the back of his head, a bullet hole, no second hole, no exit wound, and no bullet inside of his body. And in addition to this one big anomaly that, there is no bullet, the coroner also noticed two other things that were strange. The first was that Eugene had something known as a calcium ridge on the back of his head near the area where there was this hole. And it's a genetic thing. Basically, there's a section of his skull that was harder, but also more brittle. This would have been something he was born with and likely basically didn't affect him in any way, but considering it was near the area where there's this hole in his head, the coroner flagged it. And then the other thing the coroner noticed is that when he looked at Eugene's internal organs, like in his abdomen, they were a very bright cherry red color. Now, at first glance, the coroner actually didn't necessarily think that the color of his organs really mattered that much. But as the coroner really just could not make sense of how Eugene actually died, he began to go back to the color of the organs, and he thought of something. And so he went to the police and he asked Sergeant Johnson to, just in case, go back to Eugene's apartment and check for this one very specific thing. If it's there, it explains this whole thing. And sure enough, Sergeant Johnson and the police, they went back to Eugene's apartment and they found the thing that the coroner suspected would be there. And it did explain the whole mystery. And it turned out what happened to Eugene was not even close to what Sergeant Johnson originally suspected. Eugene was not murdered. He was not shot in the head, nor did he take his own life. In fact, there was no shooting. He was not shot to death either by himself or by somebody else. Instead, what the coroner suspected from seeing those bright red organs is that maybe Eugene died from carbon monoxide poisoning, which can cause your organs to turn bright cherry red. And so when they went to his apartment, they discovered his heater was leaking and it was emitting poisonous carbon monoxide gas. And so the mystery of how Eugene died was solved. He died from carbon monoxide poisoning. But how he got this hole in his head is a whole other story. After Eugene passed out on his couch from this poisoning, the gas caused his brain to swell. And because he had that calcium ridge on the back of his head that he was born with, that's that harder but more brittle part of his skull, well, as his brain continued to swell, it eventually broke through that calcium ridge and basically his head exploded. His brain blew out the back of his head, giving the impression that he had been shot. One afternoon in the spring of 1998, a 64-year-old man named Klaus Schmidt walked through the international terminal of the Dublin airport in Ireland. And for some reason, as he was walking, he just felt really, really nervous. Like the idea of getting on his plane today just felt like a really bad idea. When Klaus finally spotted his gate at the end of the terminal, that feeling of almost dread really just totally washed over him. Now, Klaus generally was kind of a nervous flyer, but he never had this sort of existential dread before boarding a flight. This was new. This felt different. And so finally, when he got to the end of his terminal and actually saw his gate and saw people boarding his flight, he almost had like a panic attack. And he thought, maybe I should just listen to my gut feeling here and not board this plane and just, fly out tomorrow or something. But as he's standing there looking at the people getting on this flight, his logical side of his brain began taking over, and he just told himself that he was just being really nervous here, that there was nothing to be worried about, that he should just get on the flight, that it'll be over soon, and he was just overreacting. And so even though he really could not fully get rid of this feeling he had, this dread that was like in his stomach at this point, he kind of overrode how he was feeling, walked up to the gate, scanned his ticket, and boarded the flight. About an hour later, and Klaus, he's in the aircraft, they've taken off by this point, and they're flying over the Irish Sea, and Klaus, he was by the window, he raised up the blind on his window, and he looked out, and it was, smooth sailing out there, the water's beautiful and calm down below, and he looked around at the other passengers and saw people were, relaxed. They were reading and relaxing and chatting, like there was no reason to think anything was going wrong on this flight. But still, Klaus just could not get rid of this feeling, and he just desperately wanted the plane to land and be done with this thing. But Klaus knew he couldn't speed the plane up, and so instead he just kind of did some breathing exercises and tried to calm himself down, and at first it was working. But over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, Klaus started to feel like he was having a hard time breathing. And he began looking around to see if other passengers were also struggling to breathe. Like maybe there's something wrong with the cabin pressure. Maybe there's something wrong with the air inside of the plane, but he'd look around and everybody still seems completely fine. It's just Klaus, who by this point is, he's sweating, he's rocking back and forth, he's so anxious, he just desperately wants this flight to be over. But again, it was like this inability to breathe continued to get worse and worse, and then he started to feel this really intense tightness in his chest, and he was telling himself, like, I'm having a panic attack. That's what's happening here. It's like my anxiety is fully taken over. I can't control it. And so he took off his jacket and he kind of unbuttoned his shirt, and he's like dripping sweat, and the other passengers now are starting to take notice of Klaus. Like something's going on with this guy, but no one said anything yet. And Klaus, he's trying to stay calm, but he keeps looking around and everybody else seems fine and something's going on with him. And then that tightness in his chest, it got so bad that Klaus realized that this likely was not anxiety. He could be having a heart attack. And then as soon as he realized that that likely was what was happening to him, it was like all of his symptoms got 10 times worse. And before long, he felt himself kind of fading out of consciousness. He heard other passengers near him yelling out for help, clearly about him. And then a flight attendant ran over and began yelling out to the rest of the plane, "Are there any doctors on board?" And so as Klaus is drifting further and further into unconsciousness, all he could think to himself was his intuition was right. Something bad was going to happen on this plane. But before he could think much more about it, his vision went blurry and he faded into darkness. But it would turn out that Klaus's intuition was actually only half right. Because while it was true that something terrible did happen to him on that flight, he really did have a heart attack, it actually was his decision to get on the flight that saved his life. Because this particular flight was carrying 40 heart specialists home from an international cardiology conference, and they had samples with them of a brand new heart drug that was not yet available to the public. So when Klaus had his heart attack and the flight attendant began calling out for a doctor, well, the 40 doctors all shot their hands up in the air, and one of them rushed over and literally just gave Klaus this new medication that saved his life. A little after 3 p.m. on March 22, 1959, a 20-year-old British college student named Neil Moss stood in a cavern about 1,000 feet underground in northern England. And as he stood there, he was staring with excitement into this dark hole right in front of him. The cavern that Neil was standing inside of was known as Peak Cavern, and it was one of the biggest and most twisting cave systems in the entire country. In fact, it was so big that at one point, an entire village of 30 rope makers lived inside of this cave. And then also, after those rope makers, the cave system became a hideout for criminals and thieves because there were so many secret passageways and basically places to hide inside of the system. So basically, Peak Cavern was a pretty famous place. And as a result, basically all of it had been mapped out or at least explored by scientists and spelunkers, except for this hole right in front of Neil. It was an entrance to a tunnel that nobody even knew about. Neil and the amateur exploration group that he was a part of had discovered this entryway about 2 weeks earlier. Now, neither Neil nor anybody else in this group had actually gone into this hole yet, and the reason for that was it was pretty dangerous. I mean, the opening to this tunnel was pretty small. It was 1.5 feet by 2 feet wide at the opening, and just looking down into it, I mean, it's a dark hole that you really can't tell how tight or how far it even goes. And so once you went inside of it, the deeper you got, the higher the risk of entrapment. And so whoever actually went into this hole really needed to be prepared. But Neil and the rest of his amateur exploration group really felt like it would be worth it to try to go down this tunnel. Not just because nobody had done it before, but specifically, they thought there was a chance that beyond this tunnel, basically deep underground, if you followed it long enough, it could lead to another big open chamber that nobody had found before. And those types of big open chambers, whoever finds them gets it named after them. And so Neil and his group were thinking, hey, if we find this big chamber, it'll be named after us. We'll be famous, at least in, spelunking circles. But they also understood that there might be nothing at the other end of this tunnel. It could just be a dead end. But the only way to know for sure would be if one of the members of this group went into the hole. Now, in addition to a fear of being trapped in the hole, there were other big issues with blindly crawling into a tunnel no one's been in before. Like, for example, there could be a sudden drop-off, or running water, or some other hazard that whoever went into the hole wouldn't know about until they were facing it. And so naturally, everybody in this group was excited about the hole, but also a little apprehensive about being the guinea pig to actually go into the hole. And so after the group had kind of stood around the hole for a minute, kind of talking through who was going to do it, Neil had finally courageously volunteered to be the guinea pig. He would go down. And in many ways, Neil was kind of like the perfect candidate for this job. He was smart, he was strong, and most importantly, he was thin, which meant he could navigate a really tight space. The only drawback to Neil was he was pretty tall. He was over 6 feet. And generally speaking, the best cavers in the world are very short and thin because it allows them to get into the smallest, tightest spaces underground. And so Neil, who was standing over the hole, began to mentally prepare himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his flashlight and he shined it straight down into this hole, which again is a pretty narrow hole, and it basically went straight down. And as he was shining it, he saw about 12 feet down, the hole kind of turned and you couldn't see what was beyond it. And so Neil knew the only part of this trip he would know about is that first 12 feet. Once he made that turn, everything beyond that was totally unknown. Literally no one in the world knew what was beyond it. But Neil was about to find out. The cave explorers anchored this 75-foot-long wire ladder that was all rolled up to this rock that was inside the cavern right near the opening to this hole. And once that was in place, they spooled out the ladder and kind of dumped it down into the hole. And so it fell 12 feet down and landed right where this tunnel turned and sort of went into oblivion where nobody knows what happened after that. And so Neil, his job was going to be to go into this hole feet first, go down 12 feet, and then with his feet, as he kind of blindly crawled backwards feet first into the tunnel, he'd be kicking with his feet this ladder, extending it farther and farther into this tunnel. The idea was this ladder was his way back out again. So he's basically on top of the ladder, making his way, and at any point he can just grab the ladder and climb back out again. And so once the ladder was in place and all the cave explorers were kind of waiting for Neil walked up to the edge of the hole, he took a deep breath, and then he swung one leg into the hole, placed it on one of the rungs of the ladder, put his other leg on the ladder as well, and kind of tested it to make sure the rock that was anchoring the ladder could hold his weight. Once he was sure it could, he said goodbye to the explorers and then began his descent, feet first, down into the hole. As Neil slowly and carefully climbed down this ladder during this first 12-foot section, he felt the walls of this hole closing in on him. When he was close to the bottom of this first section, the walls were literally flush with his shoulders and back. This was a really tight space. And so finally he got to the very bottom of this 12-foot section, and he was about to step onto what he thought was another rung, because he can't actually see where he's going. He's just using his feet to feel. And he stepped down and he felt something hard. It was the ground. So he had reached the bottom of the 12-foot section. He kind of tested the ground with his foot, seeing if it would support his weight. And after feeling confident, he stepped off the ladder and just stood at the bottom of the hole. At this point, Neil used his feet to kick the ladder that was still coiled up at the bottom of the hole into the next turn, into the next section of the tunnel that he'd be going down. and as soon as he kicked it, he heard it kind of spool out as it tumbled down this next section. However, it was not a straight drop like this first section was. This next section he'd be going into was more of a gradual decline, just based on the sound this ladder was making as it tumbled down. And so after the ladder had stopped making noise and he knew it had stopped, Neil gave one final look up at his friends above, gave them a little wave, even though he could barely move his hands because it's so tight around him, and then he got down on his stomach and, feet first, began shimmying himself down into this next section. Now, during the first 12 feet and during the initial turn into this new section, Neil had been able to turn his head and basically look down and see where his feet were going. But after only a few feet of going into this new section, the walls had become so tight on his body that he couldn't even move his head. He really was blind and had no idea where he was going. Now, for a lot of people, this would have been a claustrophobic nightmare. Neil is in this unbelievably tight space. He has no idea what's gonna happen next. He doesn't know if it's gonna get so tight he'll get wedged in there. It's cold, it's damp. I mean, it's pitch black in there. He does have a headlamp, but his head is like kind of pressed to the ground and he can't really move it. So, he's not really able to look around him. And periodically, as he was shimmying his way down deeper into this tunnel, he would dislodge rocks from the wall and he would hear them strike the wall as they tumbled down into oblivion. He had no idea if these rocks were tumbling into a dead end or if they were tumbling off a ledge somewhere, a ledge that he wouldn't be aware of until he got to it. But for Neil, this environment was something he thrived in. It was why he was so drawn to cave exploration. As much as cave exploring was a physical exercise and a physical test, it was much more a mental test. I mean, can you handle being in these tight spaces and persevering and continuing on when you're all by yourself and it's like dangers all around you? And also, Neil just loved being alone and in the dark. So cave exploration was like perfect for him. When Neil had made it about 10 feet down this new section, his feet touched the rolled up section of the ladder. And so with his toes, he kind of gave it a kick and the ladder tumbled for a second and he could hear it. And then it just kind of vanished altogether, like the ladder had gone over a cliff. And so Neil realized, very likely, just beyond his feet, even though he cannot see it, is a ledge, and very likely either a drop-off or a new cavern. The thing they hope is on the other end of this tunnel. And so this was exciting for Neil. He felt a rush of adrenaline. There's a new turn in the tunnel, and for all he knows, this is the cavern they're looking for. Or it's just another section of tunnel he would have to explore. But either way, he's making progress. And so Neil very carefully scooched backwards until he felt the edge, at which point he let his legs go over the edge, he found his footing on the ladder, and it was at this point when he kind of turned around a little bit that he could see this was not some big open cavern he had found, it was just a turn in the tunnel system. It was now going back to basically a vertical hole, big enough to fit inside of, but Neil has no idea how deep it goes or what it leads to. But Neil was totally undeterred. He lowered his whole body into the section, got on the ladder, and began descending. And very quickly, as he began this descent, the walls of this section, this new vertical section, were so tight, it was about 18 inches in diameter, that he actually couldn't just go straight down. His body didn't fit just trying to maneuver down. So the only way he could get himself to go down further was to like shimmy himself side to side like a corkscrew, basically forcing his body deeper and deeper into this hole. And so Neil continued doing this for an additional 18 feet down in this new section of tunnel, which put him at a total of 40 feet down into this tunnel from the entrance where the rest of his friends were. And when he got down there, 18 feet down, he went to step onto the rung to continue his descent, but his foot hit rock. And he felt around with his feet, and he realized this tunnel did not lead to a big new chamber. It instead was a dead end after all. Now, just to be sure, Neil actually kicked as hard as he could. He's kind of restricted, but he kicked with his legs as much as he could to see if maybe this wasn't a true dead end. Maybe it was just an obstruction and he could clear it. But he could tell, after a few stomps, this was not moving. This really was the end. Now, part of Neil was disappointed because he was hoping that by doing this, they would discover this big new chamber and they'd get it named after them. But on the other hand, he was also relieved because by this point, it was extremely claustrophobic, even for a guy who thrived in this environment. By the bottom of this 40-foot section, he is completely wedged in place. And so Neil decided it was time to head back to the surface. But from where he was at, he couldn't even hear his friends. He's way down deep in this tunnel. It's totally pitch black. And so what he needed to do was just begin climbing back up this ladder. And then, about halfway up, he could call up to his friends and tell them, hey, I'm returning. But remember, to get to where Neil is, he has literally forced his body down into this tiny hole, basically corkscrewing himself as deep as he could get. And so he's totally restricted, and his arms are basically by his side, and his hands are basically pinned in front of his body. And so Neil tried to grab the ladder, which is literally pressed up against his chest, to begin the ascent. But even though his fingers could touch the rungs of the ladder, he couldn't actually move his arms to pull himself up the ladder. He could just hold the rung. That was it. But Neil had been in similar situations before, and what you do is you just use your legs. You drive with your legs and push your body up until your arms can go above your head, and then you continue the ascent. However, his legs also were basically in the same situation. It was so unbelievably tight around his legs that he couldn't lift his legs up. He could just basically wiggle his feet. Basically, there was no way physically for Neil to get himself out. He would need his team up above to pull him out. And so Neil began shouting as loud as he could, trying to get the attention of his friends up above, telling them, hey, I'm stuck, pull me out. And then also, as best as he could with his hands on the rung, he kind of pulled on the ladder, signaling to them like, hey, get me out of here. Now, he couldn't really hear anything up above. It was sort of muffled, and he couldn't tell if they were yelling back down to him. But as he was holding onto the ladder, he felt a little bit of tension, suggesting they were pulling on him. However, as he held on, waiting to be pulled up and out, he didn't budge. Like, despite the tension on this ladder clearly coming from the surface from his friends, he wasn't moving. And that's when Neil realized he had made a critical mistake. When he had reached the bottom of this tunnel, when he realized it was a dead end, he had stomped with his feet to confirm it really was a dead end. And when he had done that, he had inadvertently kicked the rungs of this ladder into a crevice, and then rocks, which he had heard kind of falling when he was kicking, landed on top of it, basically pinning the ladder in place. Basically, this ladder was now anchored inside the cave, which meant no matter how hard his friends on the surface pulled, they would not be able to pull the ladder up, which meant they couldn't pull Neil up. And Neil, once he realized this was the issue, he tried to move his feet to clear the rocks off the bottom of the ladder, but he couldn't. It was too tight around him. And so Neil was totally stuck. The members of Neil's exploration group pretty much immediately realized this was a crisis, because not only was Neil stuck in this cave, but in these tight little tunnels underground, there's limited oxygen. So it's not just a matter of, we'll figure it out and get Neil out somehow. It's like, no, you have a limited amount of time before Neil runs out of oxygen down there. Even if you come up with a solution, it might be too late. And so immediately, members of the exploration group left Peak Cavern to go get help. And before long, over 200 people had flooded the cavern, including a mountain rescue unit and a coal mining extraction team and a whole bunch of civilians who were all there to try to figure out how to get Neil out. Now, at first, Neil was very optimistic about his recovery. He could hear clearly all the commotion 40 feet above him. He couldn't fully discern what was going on there, but he could clearly tell a major rescue operation was afoot. And so as ropes were cast down and ladders were cast down to try to get him out, and they continued to fail, and as the air he was breathing began to thin out and it was getting harder to breathe, Neil's reaction was to kind of be positive. He actually began cracking jokes and calling up like, hey, how much longer do I have to wait down here? But as the minutes turned into hours and none of the efforts by any of the rescuers were working, Neil began to panic. His heart was racing, not only from his nerves, but also because he was running out of oxygen. He had begun to grit his teeth really hard to kind of control his fear, but he was really starting to lose it. At one point, the rescuers threw down an oxygen mask for him to breathe because it was clear the air was becoming a real issue. But even though the mask literally tumbled down and hit him right on the head, so it's right here, he couldn't get his arms up to put the mask on. And so there it is, salvation, but he couldn't use it. And so before long, Neil sort of began drifting in and out of consciousness. One moment he'd be calling up to his rescuers, asking for an update. The next, they'd call down to him and get no response. Clearly, this situation was becoming dire. Now, to this point, the way the rescue had gone was the rescuers were basically throwing equipment into the hole, be it ladders or ropes or oxygen masks for Neil to grab onto or put on him, and they were hoping that basically Neil could get himself out of the hole. Because the great fear was, if we send a rescuer, or rescuers plural, into this hole to get him, they could get stuck, and now we have an even bigger problem. But when Neil began losing consciousness, when they couldn't get him to call back to them, they knew they were genuinely running out of time. And so they began pumping oxygen into the hole to hopefully buy some extra time. And then they decided, we gotta send someone into the hole. Someone has to go in there, get Neil, and pull him out. And so one by one, these courageous rescuers went down into the hole, and 8 times they tried, and 8 times they failed. All 8 either got stuck along the way or they passed out along the way. 3 people actually reached Neil and actually touched Neil, but there was no way to grab him and pull him out. And so Neil, who was conscious for a lot of this, like he's hearing and literally in some cases seeing rescue. It's right there, it's right in front of him, but it just didn't work. By the time the 8th man was pulled back out of the hole, they could hear in the hole this horrible sound, which was Neil gasping for air. Even though they were attempting to pump air into this hole, it wasn't enough, and Neil just couldn't fill his lungs with enough oxygen. And so the rescuers yelled into the hole for Neil to just hold on. They were gonna get him out of there, just be strong, hold on. But by this point, Neil, he wasn't even saying anything back. He just continued making these awful gasping sounds. By about 7 p.m., when Neil had been stuck in this hole for 4 hours, the rescuers decided to send one more guy into this hole, this really small civilian. And he went down there with a rope to attach around Neil and hopefully pull him out. And this little civilian managed to get all the way down, all the way to Neil. And when he found Neil, Neil was unconscious, but alive. And the rescuer put the rope around Neil's shoulders and then signaled to the surface to begin pulling. And so from the surface, they pulled on this rope, and slowly but surely, Neil began to be pulled out of the hole. And he moved about 18 inches, being monitored by the civilian who was down there. However, because they were pulling so hard on this rope to get Neil to move, the pressure from that rope was basically crushing Neil's chest, and he stopped breathing. And the civilian who was down there with Neil noticed it and yelled up to the group to stop. And they had to take the rope off because, yeah, they might be able to pull him out this way, but they would kill him. He would suffocate. And so once the civilian rescuer came out of the hole, he told the group, like, look, Neil's body is simply too big to be yanked out of the hole safely. He needs to be conscious and able to contort and twist his body, basically undoing what Neil did to get down there in order to get out again. Like, we need his participation, and he's unconscious, so we can't do that. And so at this point, the rescuers were totally desperate. You know, they know Neil is still alive. They can hear some of his ragged breathing coming out of the hole, but they knew they had to do something drastic right now or Neil was gonna die. And so they came up with this plan for this even smaller rescuer, this woman, to go down into the hole, get to Neil, and break his collarbone to try to shrink his body to be able to pull him out. And so this woman, she goes down there and she reaches Neil, but she failed to break his collarbone. And so she too had to come out of the hole, leaving Neil behind. And so once the woman came out of the hole, it became clear to the rescuers that Neil was not getting out of this hole, even though he was just 40 feet away and at this moment still very much alive. They could hear his ragged breathing, but there was just nothing anybody could do. And so one of the rescuers called Neil's father and told him, you need to come out to Peak Cavern. Not long after that, Neil's father, Eric Moss, arrived at Peak Cavern. Now, he knew going into this that his son was stuck. That's why he got the phone call to come out here. But he did not understand just how dire the situation really was. But as soon as he got to Peak Cavern and saw all these vehicles outside and the hundreds of rescuers coming in and out of the cave with these sad, dark expressions on their faces, Eric knew this was really bad. And so Eric made his way into Peak Cavern, and for hours he just hoped and prayed that whatever was happening would be enough to get his son out. And for hours, Eric just stood there in Peak Cavern, hoping to see his son emerge from the hole, hoping to come up and say everything is okay, but he didn't. And things only got worse. It eventually began to rain, and unfortunately, Peak Cavern, and specifically the hole that Neil was stuck inside of, flood when it rains. And so as rainwater is pouring into this cavern and Neil is still alive but stuck in this hole, they had to make the heart-wrenching decision in front of Neil's father to abandon the operation and get out of the cave, knowing Neil was going to die. Rescuers were finally able to get back into Peak Cavern at about 3 a.m. on March 24th, which is approximately 36 hours after Neil got trapped. By this point, the rains had subsided, the flood had cleared, and so they went in there hoping for a miracle. And when they got to the hole and listened into it, they actually heard Neil still breathing. He was still alive, but it was very clear he was at the end of his life. And all they could do was just sit around this hole and listen as Neil took his last few final ragged breaths. And then eventually they listened as Neil took his final breath and the hole went silent. Now, at this point, it was too dangerous to send anybody back down into this hole, and so no one could get physically close enough to Neil to actually confirm that he really is dead. However, after the hole remained silent for quite a while, a doctor who was on site did walk over and declare Neil dead. And so at this point, the rescue operation became a recovery operation. However, as rescuers were getting ready to go back down into the hole to retrieve Neil's body, it was at this point that Neil's father, Eric Moss, who had been there this whole time and had been witness to the doctor declaring his son dead, it was at this point that he stepped in and said, "Stop, get everybody out of the cave. I don't want anybody else to lose their lives." And so ultimately, Eric made the decision to leave his son's body where it was. Eventually, once it was 100% certain that Neil really must be dead at this point, they would fill in the hole that Neil had climbed down inside of with loose rocks from the cave, entombing him inside of it forever. And in his memory, the tunnel that Neil died inside of was named after him. It's called Moss Chamber. Early on the morning of August 19th, 1991, a 32-year-old man named Bobby Curley stood in his recently renovated kitchen in the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He walked over to his fridge, opened it up, reached inside, and grabbed his bag lunch along with his thermos, and he was just about to head out the door and go to work, but he stopped and gave his wife Joanne a kiss on the cheek and said he loved her, and then he left for the day. So Bobby and Joanne had been married for a year, and they lived with Joanne's 4-year-old daughter, Angela, in a duplex in a working-class neighborhood. Bobby was an electrician, and so he made pretty good money, but the Curleys were by no means rich. However, Bobby knew that that actually might change soon, because Joanne was on the verge of winning this big court settlement. Joanne had actually been married once before, but her husband had died in a car accident about 3 years ago. His car had collided with a tractor trailer, and the driver of that tractor trailer was eventually found to be the one at fault. And so now, Joanne's lawyers and the trucking company's lawyers were finally closing in on a financial settlement to compensate Joanne for her first husband's wrongful death. It had been a really stressful process, and Bobby had definitely noticed that Joanne had been more sullen and stressed than usual as they were going through it. But now that the case was finally wrapping up, Joanne did appear to be sort of back in good spirits. And, while nothing was official yet, it looked like they were going to receive approximately $1 million in compensation, which was obviously really exciting. In fact, the two of them were already mapping out how they might spend some of this money. Some of the ideas they had come up with included taking Angela on a few big trips, and also maybe using some of that money to finally fund Bobby having his own business, something he had always wanted to do, but lacked the resources for. But for now, the settlement was not complete, and so Bobby had to go to his normal 9 to 5 and, punch the clock and keep earning money for the family. So for today, once he was outside, he simply got into his car and made the short drive to his current job site. 10 minutes later, Bobby parked outside of a science building on the campus of Wilkes University, which was a small college in Wilkes-Barre. He saw some of the guys on his crew standing out front, waiting to be let into this building. So Bobby, who was the foreman of their crew, he got out of his car and said good morning to everyone and then walked up and unlocked the doors. Then they all went inside and got to work. And working at this location had really become a pretty big routine for this group, because by now, Bobby and his crew had been coming here, working here for a few months now. And this job was a really big job. Bobby and his team were helping renovate the entire building, which included all the classrooms, all the laboratories, hallways, everything. And so they still had quite a bit of work to do. But there was another reason this job was taking as long as it was. And that was because when Bobby's crew had first shown up at the building, They had expected it to be totally prepared for them, meaning all furniture and equipment would be cleared out. But instead, they found a ton of stuff just kind of everywhere inside the building, because the building clearly had not been prepped at all. The chemistry lab, for example, still had random flasks and chemical bottles and, wet rags with weird substances on them just laying around the room. So, as a result, Bobby and his crew had been forced to do a ton of cleanup, before they even got into their jobs that they had not planned on, and it really set them back. And so now, just to stay on schedule, they were regularly putting in 12-hour days basically every day they were there. And so all these extra hours had Bobby feeling completely exhausted, and lately, he had sort of felt kind of sick almost, and he just sort of chalked that up to basically overworking. But Bobby never complained. The overtime pay was great, and he really enjoyed working with these particular guys on this crew. These guys were basically his friends. So normally, the long work days were actually kind of fun, as exhausting and awful as they were. Later that afternoon, Bobby was standing on a ladder inside of that chemistry lab, running electrical wires above the ceiling panels. And as he was doing that, he suddenly heard this loud commotion coming from across the room. Bobby realized what he was hearing were guys on his crew basically shouting and laughing. So he climbed down to see what was going on. And when he walked over there, he saw that everybody was gathered around one of the members of the crew, whose name was Sammy DePasquale. And Sammy was sort of doubled over, coughing and spitting and holding a Coke can in his hand. Another member of the crew, whose name was Robert Marconi, explained to Bobby when he walked over that somebody had swapped out Sammy's Coke with a different Coke can, one that was filled with chewing tobacco spit instead of soda. Bobby cringed. This was absolutely disgusting. Even as a prank, this was awful. But it was also sort of par for the course for the guys on Bobby's crew. This is sort of what they did. They were always playing pranks on each other to kind of lighten the mood on long work days like today. And everybody was laughing, even Sammy, who'd been the butt of the joke. And so eventually, Bobby joined in too. He thought that this was ultimately good for morale, as gross as it was. And after a minute or so, Sammy recovered from his coughing fit from drinking this disgusting liquid and vowed sort of comically to get payback on whoever switched his Coke can. Then after that, all the guys got back to work. And so Bobby, he left the group and went back over to his ladder. And as he was climbing back up, he paused about halfway because he felt this sudden wave of sickness come over him. It almost felt like he had a flu coming on, which didn't really surprise him because he had been doing all these overtime hours and he really had felt run down as a result of it. And so again, he's just sort of chalking up the way he feels to overworking. And so as Bobby is standing on this ladder, he kind of told himself, just suck it up, this will pass. And he just stood there on the ladder. And after a minute or two, that sensation of being sick did sort of pass. And then, because he was not a complainer, he was a hardworking guy, he just pushed the sickness feeling he was having out of his mind. He climbed back up and got back to doing his wiring. But 4 days later, on the morning of Friday, August 23rd, Bobby felt worse than ever. As he made his way across the college parking lot towards the science building where his crew was still working, he felt like his feet were heavy and he was constantly short of breath. And then as the workday went on, continuing to run wires in that chem lab, Bobby got really sweaty and really hot. His coworkers noticed and kept coming up to him to ask if he needed to go home early. But even though Bobby totally did need to go home early and felt awful, he would just tell them nope, he was just fine. And so Bobby would manage to get through that particular workday. But then at the end of the day, when it was time to go home, Bobby felt so relieved. He could not wait to just get home, crawl into bed, and sleep. But by the next morning, Saturday morning, that heavy feeling in Bobby's feet had turned into this really intense burning pain that actually went all the way up his legs. And then his hands went numb. At this point, Bobby had to admit to himself that this was not a symptom of overworking. He was sick, like something was wrong with him. So he went to his doctor. But the doctor told him that despite what he was feeling, the symptoms were not that serious. Like it didn't appear that something was seriously wrong with him. And so ultimately, he just told Bobby to, go home and get more rest. That's what you need right now. So that's exactly what Bobby did. For the rest of that Saturday and all day the next day, Sunday, Bobby didn't do anything except lay in bed. But by that Sunday evening, Bobby still felt horrible. So he picked up the phone and did something that Bobby basically never did. He called one of his coworkers and told them that unfortunately, he would not be able to come to work tomorrow. When Bobby woke up the next morning, on Monday morning, the day he had taken off from work, he was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up on his own. His wife, Joanne, tried to help him get out of bed and go to the bathroom, but he was physically too heavy for her to lift. And so Joanne actually ended up calling Bobby's brother, David, to come over the house and help. But even with David there, who could now basically help move Bobby around the house, it was very clear to Bobby that whatever was happening to him was not some minor issue. Like, this was serious, and it clearly was not going away with rest like the doctor had said it would. And so at some point that day, the family called an ambulance, which came and took Bobby to a nearby hospital. But by the time they got there, the pain in Bobby's legs had gotten so bad that Bobby was literally periodically screaming in pain, and he also had begun to vomit. But after several hours of nonstop pain and nonstop testing at the hospital doctors came into Bobby's room and they told him and his family that they actually had good news. They knew what was wrong with Bobby, and it was treatable. They diagnosed him with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a condition where the body's immune system attacks the nerves and causes tingling in the feet and hands. But the staff assured Bobby that all he needed was a very specific medication, and then he would feel a whole lot better. Bobby was incredibly relieved, as was his family, and that day he began taking the medication, and quickly his pain became tolerable, he stopped vomiting, and before long, he actually felt good enough that he was able to go home. It seemed like Bobby had really turned a corner here, and that everything really was going to be okay. But within just a few days of being back home again, Bobby's pain came back even worse than before, despite still taking this medication. And he also began experiencing a new symptom. His hair started falling out. On September 7th, so now a week and a half after Bobby came back from the hospital, well, he was back there again. And to Bobby's horror, this time, his doctors actually seemed kind of baffled by his symptoms. They told him that sudden extreme hair loss was definitely not a symptom of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So they told Bobby that it seemed like their initial diagnosis must have been wrong, despite the fact that the medication they gave him to treat GBS had helped him for a little while. And so the problem now was the doctors were basically at a total loss as to how to help Bobby. They really didn't know what was going on. And so for the next 9 days, doctors ran test after test on Bobby, and all the while, Bobby's pain intensified so much and became so constant that he basically fell into this almost delirious state, like the pain was completely too much. And then eventually, all these doctors who ran all these tests came back to Bobby and his family, and they just told them that we don't know what's wrong. Like, all these tests did not provide any clarity, and so basically we can't help you. And they told Bobby that now the only choice was he needed to be transferred to a bigger, more specialized medical facility in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles away from Wilkes-Barre. A few days later, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan walked down the hallway of the bigger hospital in Hershey, Pennsylvania. He was heading to the room where his patient, Bobby Curley, was staying. And even from several yards down the hallway, Dr. Brennan could already hear Bobby screaming and cursing at the nurses. Ever since Bobby had arrived at this hospital, his behavior had gotten more and more unhinged. At one point, Bobby had even thrown medical equipment across the room. And so now Dr. Brennan had to keep Bobby physically restrained to his bed. And so Dr. Brennan, when he reached Bobby's room, took a deep breath out in the hallway, and then into the room he walked. And inside, he saw Bobby strapped down to the bed, and he was screaming and thrashing around violently. And Dr. Brennan found himself just feeling awful about it. I mean, he felt really bad for Bobby. But really, he didn't know what to do for Bobby. He and his staff had tried basically everything they could think of to try to treat Bobby's pain, but nothing had worked. And so, on this day, Dr. Brennan couldn't do anything except what he normally did, which was just stand in Bobby's room sort of helplessly as Bobby screamed and flailed in pain. But on September 22nd, so 6 days after Bobby arrived in Hershey, he finally fell silent, because on that day, he slipped into a coma. 3 days later, Dr. Brennan felt very defeated as he stepped into Bobby's hospital room. There, he saw 5 members of Bobby's family: his wife Joanne, his 4-year-old stepdaughter Angela, Bobby's adult siblings Susan and David, and Bobby's elderly mother Mary. They'd all come to be with Bobby after he had fallen into this coma. Now, they looked up at Dr. Brennan expectantly. And Dr. Brennan, he took a deep breath and he said he had some bad news. New test results had come back, and now, based on those results, they knew what was wrong with Bobby. Dr. Brennan told the family that what Bobby was suffering from was something called thallium toxicity. And when he said this, Dr. Brennan watched the family for some kind of a reaction. But the family just stared blankly at him like they had no idea what that meant. So Dr. Brennan went on and explained that thallium is an extremely toxic chemical. In fact, it can kill anyone who touches it, ingests it, or even just inhales its fumes. And he told them that, this is really unusual because thallium is highly controlled in the United States. It's actually banned in household products. So this is not a chemical that, Bobby just could have accidentally stumbled upon. This is pretty rare. And so at this point, Dr. Brennan just paused and let the family sit with this new information. And the family, they looked at each other like, wow, this is awful, but nobody knew how to react. They just kind of looked back at the doctor, waiting for him to explain more. But when the doctor didn't say anything, Bobby's sister, Susan, just asked in a quavering voice, what can we do? At that point, Dr. Brennan just shook his head and said, unfortunately, there's no cure for thallium poisoning. 2 days later, on September 27th, Joanne stood next to her unconscious husband in the hospital, and she nodded at the medical staff that was gathered all around him. It was ultimately Joanne's decision whether or not to keep Bobby on life support. But with no hope of a cure, Joanne had ultimately decided that the best thing to do was to take him off life support. And so after giving the signal to medical staff, Joanne, her daughter, and the rest of Bobby's family, they kind of stepped back from the bed, and they watched as the staff walked over and removed Bobby's ventilator. And then Joanne had to watch as her husband took his final breath. On the evening of October 21st, 1991, so about a month after Bobby died from thallium poisoning, a police detective named Harold Cawley sat at a big table with 7 other men inside of a steakhouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The other men were a mixture of coroners and investigators from all across Pennsylvania. Some were from the Hershey area, where Bobby had died. The rest, like Cawley, worked for the police in Wilkes-Barre, where Bobby had lived. The men were there discussing the investigation into Bobby's death, and they had been doing this for the past 3 hours already, because there really was so much to talk about. They had already covered Bobby's initial autopsy results, which showed that he had a staggering 900 times the lethal limit of thallium in his system when he died. And so they were working under the assumption that Bobby must have been poisoned by a single massive dose of thallium. Whether accidentally or on purpose, they didn't know. And so they discussed theories for how this could have even happened to him. Because remember, thallium is not just a chemical you can get from the store. This is something that is highly regulated. So how did he come in contact with it? Their first thought had been basically what everybody else suspected, which was, Bobby must have been accidentally poisoned at the Wilkes University chemistry lab where he'd been working for so many months. And they actually had a bunch of records from a preliminary examination of the lab. And according to these records, one of the first things investigators had found inside of that lab was 5 vials of thallium in one of the storerooms. They'd also found a rag that was laying out on a countertop that presumably was there when Bobby first arrived and he and his crew began cleaning everything up. And next to this rag was a handwritten note that had a warning on it that literally said, "Thallium wiping rag, touch me and die." The rag had actually caused a huge amount of panic amongst the investigators when they had gone in to begin sweeping the lab for signs of thallium, because people were fearful that maybe they'd brushed up against it and touched this rag, and were they going to get thallium poisoning? However, they actually tested the rag and it came back negative for thallium, as did all the surfaces in the lab and also the air in the lab. And so the investigators had finally decided that that note must have been a joke or something. Also, the university insisted that all of its thallium was accounted for, meaning none of it could have been, stolen or misused in some way to poison Bobby because they would know about it. And so at this point, the university had actually been sort of ruled out as where Bobby got poisoned, which really didn't make sense to Detective Cawley or the other investigators at this dinner, because again, thallium is hard to come by. The idea that Bobby was working in a lab that contained thallium, but that wasn't where he was poisoned by thallium, seemed almost impossible. It had to have happened there. But they had gone out and tested all of Bobby's coworkers who had also worked in that lab with Bobby for so many days and so many hours, and they all came back negative for thallium exposure. However, Bobby's own family, his wife Joanne and her 4-year-old daughter Angela, they had tested positive for thallium exposure. Granted, it was on a near microscopic level because any amount of exposure could actually be lethal, and those two were okay, so obviously they had not received a lethal dose. But there were very small traces of thallium in both of them, which was odd. And so everybody at the table agreed that the right thing to do here was to speak to Joanne and see if maybe she had some ideas of how she and her daughter and obviously Bobby could have maybe come in contact with this very rare and lethal chemical. And then also, they need to get inside of the family's duplex to search it, literally, for thallium. But first, there was the problem of jurisdiction. Bobby had died in Hershey, but he'd gotten sick in Wilkes-Barre. So, after some discussion, the men decided that the Wilkes-Barre police should be the ones to head up the case because that is where Bobby actually got poisoned. The next day, Detective Cawley invited Bobby's siblings, David and Suzanne, to the Wilkes-Barre police station. And right away, it was quite clear that both of them were very suspicious of Bobby's wife, Joanne. They told Cawley that Joanne had been acting really strange for months, both before and also after Bobby's death. David said when his brother had first gotten sick, Joanne had barely lifted a finger to help him. She'd called David to come over and look after Bobby, acting like she needed somebody strong enough to move Bobby around, which was true. But while David was upstairs literally carrying Bobby to and from the bathroom, Joanne stayed downstairs with her daughter and totally ignored them. She didn't even pretend to want to help. She basically let David do all of it. And Susan said, even though she didn't know for sure, her impression of Joanne right after she had taken Bobby off life support and he's died, her impression of Joanne was she was hugely relieved. Cawley listened and nodded and sort of gave the impression that he was following along and basically believed them. But inside, he wasn't really convinced that what they were describing was highly suspicious behavior. When David came over to help Bobby, that was because she had asked him to do that, after trying at first unsuccessfully to move her husband around. And then when David was there, she does have a 4-year-old daughter. She can't just leave her unsupervised. Or maybe she doesn't want her daughter to see Bobby, and so she has to keep her downstairs. So there's an explanation for that. And as for Joanne being relieved after her husband's death, everybody dealt with grief differently. And Bobby's death had been a really traumatic, drawn-out process for everybody involved. So maybe she was relieved, but not because she was happy about it. It could have just been the end of a nightmare chapter in all of their lives. And so after he had listened to their concerns, Cawley began to redirect the conversation, and he began asking David and Susan about their relationship with Bobby. They both said they were very close with their brother, even as adults. They said they lived nearby, and they saw each other quite a bit. David in particular said he spent a lot of time with Bobby. He said they often went fishing, and recently, together, they had renovated Bobby's kitchen. And this caught Cawley's attention, because it sounded like David and Bobby had finished this renovation project around the same time that Bobby first got sick. Cawley didn't know if this was relevant or not, but it was interesting. So at the end of their discussion, he just thanked David and Susan for all the information and told them they were free to go. A few days later, on the morning of October 25th, 1991, Detective Cawley and 3 other investigators sat at an interrogation table in the Wilkes-Barre police station, right across from Joanne Curley, and the lawyer that she had brought along with her. Cawley didn't know what to make of Joanne yet. Obviously, she and her daughter had also been exposed to thallium. So that could mean that they too accidentally were exposed to this chemical, same as Bobby, but obviously on a much smaller scale because they lived. Or they could have also been the target of somebody trying to poison this family, and ultimately just Bobby was killed from this poisoning. Or Joanne could be the poisoner. She could have poisoned her own husband. I mean, Bobby's siblings are talking about how awful Joanne was acting towards her husband in the wake of his illness. Maybe she poisoned him. And in doing so, she accidentally exposed herself and her daughter. Basically, Cawley couldn't tell yet if Joanne was a victim or a perpetrator. So he made sure to watch her very carefully while another investigator began asking her to explain how and when her husband first got sick. Joanne said that Bobby had been complaining about feeling pretty run down for what felt like weeks or maybe even months, but he hadn't had any major symptoms until a week before his hospitalization in August. And she said that much like Bobby, she had just kind of chalked it up to he had been overworking, or maybe he had some standard illness that would just go away with rest, like that first doctor had said. She said that she had never even heard of thallium, and really at no point had it ever crossed her mind that maybe Bobby had been poisoned by thallium. As Cawley listened to Joanne tell this story, he was struck by a couple of things. First of all, Joanne said Bobby had been feeling pretty run down for a while before his death. This seemed to conflict with investigators' assumption that a single massive dose of thallium had sent Bobby to the hospital and ultimately killed him. It seemed more likely, based on what Joanne said, that this poisoning happened over a period of time. And the second thing Cawley was struck by was actually just Joanne's general demeanor. She had just recounted in detail, the story of her husband dying, this awful, awful death. Thallium poisoning is a horrible way to die. And as she's describing it, she's not shedding a single tear or really acting at all like she's even upset about it. And so at this point, Cawley was beginning to wonder if maybe Susan and David had been right about Joanne. She really did not seem to care much about her husband's death. And so what Cawley did is he stopped the other investigator and he leaned forward and he just asked Joanne point blank, how do you explain how you and your daughter were exposed to thallium? And immediately, Joanne had a story, a bizarre one. She said Bobby really liked to drink iced tea when he was at work. So every morning, she would fill his thermos up from this big pitcher of pre-made iced tea that she kept in their fridge. And so Bobby would take that thermos with him to work and he would drink the tea all day and then come home with the thermos. And some days when he would come back, Bobby had not drank all the iced tea. There'd be some left inside the thermos. And so Joanne said what she would do in that case was she would take the remaining iced tea still in the thermos and she would pour it back into the pitcher in the fridge, basically to salvage what was left of the tea. And she said she and her daughter also drank from that pitcher. So in essence, she sometimes was drinking from the same tea that Bobby was drinking from directly. And so perhaps in that way, if he was being exposed to thallium, maybe it was getting into that tea that he was bringing home. And, she believed that maybe that was how she was being exposed, by drinking the leftover iced tea. Cawley glanced over at the other investigators in the room, and they all looked as baffled as he was. This iced tea explanation was pretty out there, but it was so weirdly specific that they really couldn't write it off. And Cawley knew that, if the iced tea theory was legitimate, it might be able to explain why all three people in this family, all living in the same place, had such drastically different levels of exposure. Basically, Bobby could be having this huge exposure to thallium outside the house, and then basically remnants of the thallium exposure are finding their way back into that leftover tea. So it's a really small amount of thallium. That's coming back home. It's being mixed inside that pitcher. And so when Joanne and her daughter are drinking from that pitcher, they're only getting a very small amount of thallium. And so again, it's out there, but it would explain it. So Cawley asked Joanne if he had her permission to not just search her whole duplex to check for thallium, but specifically check her fridge, check her pitcher, her iced tea pitcher, and all the thermoses that Bobby brought to work to see if there was still trace levels of thallium inside of them. And he was worried when he asked her this question that she might refuse or give some reason that she couldn't, but Joanne immediately agreed without any hesitation. That same afternoon, Cawley, his investigators, and a crime scene unit arrived at the Curleys' duplex to begin their search. Cawley looked on as the crime scene unit entered the duplex and immediately began scouring every surface. And they found absolutely no trace of thallium anywhere in the house, except for in one very specific location. The thermos Joanne had already told them about, the one that Bobby would bring with the iced tea in it to work and then back again. Traces of thallium were found on the little ridges at the top of the thermos where the lid screwed back on. And this was huge, not only because now they had the first clear sign of exactly where the thallium was coming in and out of Bobby's life, but more specifically because it was at the top of this cup that obviously Bobby is drinking from. This showed that the way the thallium wound up in Bobby's system was because he ingested it. That was something they didn't know at this point. Now it seems very clear that's how it happened. But despite this revelation, it didn't explain how Joanne and Angela were also exposed, because when they tested the big pitcher of iced tea in the fridge, it didn't contain any thallium. And also, just finding the thallium at the top of the thermos didn't explain how it actually got there. But for Cawley, what really stood out about finding thallium on this thermos was that this item, this thermos, is something Bobby took to work and home every single day. So it seemed like maybe, Cawley and his staff had been too quick to rule out where Bobby was working. I mean, he was working in a chemical lab that contained thallium, and they had ruled that out as the place where he could have been poisoned. Now, it seemed like they needed to take another look. Seven months later, in late May of 1992, Detective Cawley sat at his desk, thumbing through the notes from all the interviews and polygraph tests that he and his team had carried out since the previous October. One by one, they had brought in all of Bobby's coworkers and grilled them about Bobby's death. And all of the coworkers had more or less said the same thing. Bobby was well-liked, and nobody they knew would want to harm him. Some of the coworkers did admit that they did like to prank each other a lot, but they said the pranks had always been, pretty harmless, and spiking somebody's drinks with chemicals was way, way beyond anything they ever did. At least, that's what all of them said. But two of Bobby's coworkers, Sammy DePasquale and Robert Marconi, had failed their polygraph exams. In fact, the polygraph examiner said those two had literally gotten the worst scores he had ever seen. So very quickly, those two shot to the top of Cawley's suspect list. And so Cawley had pressed both of them about whether or not they had pranked Bobby by putting thallium into his thermos. Maybe they didn't know how dangerous thallium was, but did they put something in his thermos? And they said absolutely not, they didn't do that. But Cawley didn't believe them, because he'd already heard about previous pranks that involved swapping out coworkers' drinks for things like tobacco spit. So what's to say they didn't put thallium in Bobby's thermos? It just sort of tracked. The problem was, Cawley didn't have any actual evidence that he could use to arrest either of them, especially since the university continued to insist that none of their thallium was missing from the lab. Now, Cawley knew it was possible the university was wrong, that maybe there was unaccounted for thallium, but he had no way to prove that. Cawley also felt pretty suspicious of Joanne and also Bobby's own brother, David. Joanne, for obvious reasons, was still suspicious. She had thallium in her system. She seemed oddly detached from Bobby when he was dying, kind of letting other people take care of him, and apparently was relieved when he was taken off life support. But even if Joanne had wanted to poison Bobby, it was really unclear how she would have gotten her hands on thallium. And then as for David, the reason he was sort of suspicious to Cawley is because he spent a lot of time with Bobby. And he also did that kitchen renovation with him. And so there's all these moments where he's alone, potentially handling chemicals with Bobby before he got sick. So basically, David had the opportunity to poison Bobby, but there really was no motive. And just like with Joanne, Cawley felt like, where would David get the thallium? That was the big question. Where is the thallium coming from? And so at this point, Detective Cawley was basically at a dead end and just did not know how to take this case, which was heartbreaking because earlier that day, he'd been informed that the district attorney had decided to actually shut down the investigation into Bobby's death. The case was officially cold. And so since Cawley could not revive it, all he could do was close the case file and stick it in a drawer. One morning in August of 1994, so more than 2 years after the investigation into Bobby's death was shut down, Detective Cawley walked up the porch steps of the duplex where Bobby had lived, and he knocked on the door. Cawley had been thinking a lot about this case recently, and today he was hoping that Bobby's widow, Joanne, would help him take one last shot at cracking it. A moment later, Joanne answered the door, and once the look of surprise left her face, she invited the detective inside. Cawley quickly explained to her that the reason he was here is because there had been this technological breakthrough in toxicology testing. The Wilkes-Barre police were now able to perform a new type of test that had not been available to them 3 years ago when her husband had died. And Cawley believed that, this information they could get would help them figure out what actually happened to Bobby once and for all. Joanne's eyes lit up at this news, and she was about to open her mouth to reply, but Cawley quickly added there was actually a catch. He said in order to do these tests, they would have to exhume Bobby's body. And the only person who could give investigators permission to do that was Joanne. Cawley waited while Joanne processed everything she had just been told. He tried not to let it show on his face, but Joanne's response to this would basically decide the entire fate of this case. If she said no, there really was nothing they could do. The evidence contained inside of Bobby's casket would be lost to them forever, which meant if somebody had intentionally poisoned Bobby, they would never figure out who it was, and so the killer would never be brought to justice. But unsurprisingly, Joanne said yes, of course. Later that month, on August 23rd, Cawley went to the cemetery where Bobby was buried, and he watched as a backhoe dug up his grave and pulled his casket out of the ground. The police and coroner then took custody of Bobby's body, and they would go on to perform these new toxicology tests. And when the results came in, they gave Cawley the exact information he had hoped for. Based on the police investigation, and critically, those new toxicology tests, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bobby Curley. The first time the killer slipped thallium into Bobby's thermos, Bobby was busy working in another room and didn't notice, which was exactly what the killer wanted. The killer did not hate Bobby. In fact, they really hadn't wanted to kill him until he had started talking about opening up his own business with that settlement money his family was going to get. And the killer just could not let that happen. Because if Bobby went into business for himself, he would ruin everything. The killer believed that by poisoning Bobby one time, that would kill him, and then all their problems would be solved. But the next day, Bobby actually seemed fine, sort of unfazed by the poison. So the next time the killer got the chance, they added a little more poison to Bobby's thermos. And when Bobby again stayed healthy the next day, well, the killer just added a little bit more the next time, and they just kept on doing that. They were afraid that if they added too much at once, Bobby might notice, and then they would get caught. So, for months, Bobby was being poisoned, but didn't really show any significant symptoms. But finally, in August of 1991, Bobby started showing really severe symptoms. Remember, his legs were in extreme pain, his hands were going numb, and when he called in sick to work on that Monday, that was when the killer knew. They were certain they had finished him off. Except they hadn't finished him off. Because when he went to the hospital, Bobby just continued to cling to life. So the killer actually went to visit Bobby in the hospital. And while Bobby was sleeping, the killer slipped a final, massive amount of the poison into a soda cup that Bobby kept by his bedside. And when Bobby woke up, the killer kind of casually encouraged him to drink the soda. And Bobby did so without any hesitation because Bobby had no reason not to trust the killer. Because the killer was his own wife, Joanne Curley. She had actually started poisoning him almost a year before she actually murdered him. But investigators didn't realize this until a new type of toxicology test allowed them to figure out exactly when Bobby was being poisoned. This test worked by analyzing some of the hairs that Bobby still had left on his body. Basically, every time Bobby was poisoned, a chemical marker was left behind in his hair. So as his hair grew out, the strands sort of became timelines that showed exactly when he had been poisoned. And when Cawley, through these tests, discovered that Bobby had been poisoned multiple times between October 1990 and September of 1991, these dates ruled out Bobby's coworkers and his brother David. The poisoning had simply started too early for David to be responsible and went on far too long for his coworkers to be guilty. But the timeline clearly ruled in Joanne. And when police began digging into why Joanne might have wanted to kill her husband, they realized she'd convinced Bobby to make her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy just days before poisoning him for the very first time. And so Joanne's motive was money. She did not want Bobby to have any of that financial windfall she was going to get from the death of her earlier husband, the wrongful death lawsuit where she was going to get $1 million, even though she kind of acted like, oh yeah, Bobby's going to use some of that to start his business. She didn't want that. She did not want him to have any of it. That was her money. So that was one motivation financially, and the other financial motivation was by killing Bobby, she would also receive the life insurance payout. As for where Joanne actually got the thallium, she would admit that she had used an old container of rat poison that did contain thallium that was manufactured in the US before thallium was banned in household products. On December 12, 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Joanne ultimately pled guilty and so was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. She would wind up serving all 20 years and was released from prison in 2016. Peggy Carr's life had never been very easy. She was born in 1947 in a very small rural town in Central Florida to parents who were deaf and who had almost no money. So from a young age, Peggy had to go to work, except the only jobs she could land were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous, like overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways where she would waitress there all by herself. But Peggy never complained about her job prospects. Instead, she just took whatever jobs were available because she knew that she and her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in a dangerous environment, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior to make sure no one attempted to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation amongst her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take crap from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also warded off potential romantic partners that might have been interested in her, but were kind of intimidated when they interacted with her. But eventually, one man would cut through Peggy's defenses, and they would fall in love, and they would get married, and they would have 3 kids together, and everything was great until it wasn't. The marriage would crash and burn, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was a mid-30-somethings divorced mother of 3 teenage children who had to work overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was working or when she was out in public, when she was behind closed doors at her home with her kids, they saw the real side of Peggy. And that side was just kind of sad. I mean, life had just been kind of hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she had kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, were not bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Mrballen Carr. Mrballen, who just went by his nickname, Pie, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take crap from anyone, and like Peggy, he had been kind of forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny Central Floridian rural town called Alturas, and he was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a number of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pi, they start dating, and right away, Peggy's kids notice this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she's all smiles, she's so happy. It seems like Pi is the knight in shining armor that's come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pi and Peggy would get married, much to their children's excitement. And then after the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pi and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly, even though they were living in a fairly small house. And so all 5 of them were kind of all over each other, but they got along great. And it was kind of fun to have so many people in this house all the time. It was kind of crazy and hectic, and overall the house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in with Pi and his kids, Peggy and Pi started to have marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just totally vanished, and in its place was nothing. They basically completely resented each other, and everything they did upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows each other, that Pi was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. And so Pi, he denied these accusations, but Debbie totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse, and the more they fought, the more a wedge was kind of driven down the center of this blended family, where Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pi's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pi and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these 2 families together forever. In late October of 1988, so 7 months into Peggy and Pi's now very rocky marriage, Pi suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This was not a planned trip, he just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later." And so Pi, he leaves the house, he gets in his truck, he drives off, and then a little while later, Peggy and her daughter, Sissy, they both get their things together, and they head out and they get in Peggy's car, and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. And so they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, they get their things on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. And so initially, Peggy tried to just ignore it, thinking that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom, and she sat in one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart only continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. And so as she's sitting there feeling these symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe I'm having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she washes her face, she kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom, she goes right into the staff break room, and she tells her daughter, I think I'm having a heart attack, but don't worry, I'm just gonna go home, I'm gonna lay down. If this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I wanna take it seriously, so I'm gonna leave for the day. And so Sissy is looking at her mom, really concerned, but Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person that's gonna sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back, and please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and her arms and her legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's gonna be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving. And then Peggy slipped out the back door, she got in her car, and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty, so she just went inside, she made her way to her bedroom, and she lied down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school, and when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne, because his mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a time ever that he saw his mom napping, even when she was sick. And so concerned, he went into her bedroom and she was facing away from him, and so he kind of jostled her awake, and when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale, she was sweating, she obviously had not been sleeping, she was gritting her teeth, and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of discomfort. And he said, "Mom, geez, are you okay?" And she would say to him, "Oh, no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on. I think I have a flu or something. I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off." And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll be just fine. And so Dwayne said, "Okay, well, let me know if you need anything." And so Dwayne began to walk away, but his mother would actually flag him back, and she would level with him, and she would tell him that actually something is wrong here. "I feel like someone has poured fire down my veins, in my arms and in my legs, and it is excruciatingly painful." And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight, no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really serious. And so Dwayne began telling his mom that you got to go to the hospital. We need to get Pi here to drive you to the hospital, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here. But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit reserved about it. She thought maybe she could just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi would return from his hunting trip. He would come in the house, and right away Dwayne would run over to him. He would explain to Pi, "Hey, this is not normal. My mom never ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital." But Pi would actually say, "Nah, she's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. Yeah, she'll sleep it off." But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, "Okay, I'll take her to the hospital." And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck. He drove her to the hospital and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under doctor's care at the hospital, she no longer could talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs, and her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling quickly. And so after she's been admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and to the other family members that had assembled, and they asked them, "Do you have any idea what could have caused this?" And they all said, "No, she just suddenly started feeling this way." And so the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy, she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or it just came back that everything was normal. And so they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart. None of their tests have revealed anything is wrong with her. And so they're at a loss. They don't know what's wrong with her. And so without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and begin monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms would come down. While she wasn't back completely to strength, she was able to speak again. She was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable. Her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities. But overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. And so Peggy and her family, they drive back to their home, and initially everything's okay. It seems like she's on the mend. But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart starts to race again, and before long, her arms and legs feel like they are on fire. Now, Peggy and her family, they know that the doctors don't know what this condition is. And so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy, again, was suffering from this horrible thing. But going to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to sit at the house and wait it out, the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse, to the point where she literally was completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms when she was at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before, so they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive, or just showed that, nothing was wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what's causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then the next morning, the whole situation got even worse. Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son, Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting the same symptoms as Peggy. Their heart was racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through, and they all came back negative or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition, and suddenly it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in, and he remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. And so he told his colleagues, they ran out and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and sure enough, the next day the results came back, and all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who despite being on all these painkillers is still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her, "You're gonna die. The only thing we can do is try to make you as comfortable as possible and then try to save your boys." Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma, and then 4 months later, on March 3rd, 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And then at that point, she passed away. As for her two boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point. Everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. We've all been there. You're the host for the big summer barbecue, the guests are on their way, and you realize right at that moment as you're pulling it out of the oven that you've overcooked your zebra cornea souffle. With only minutes to spare, you leap head first out of your kitchen window, shattering the glass, cutting your body badly, and then you run into the nearby jungle and you tackle a wallaby and you knock a few teeth loose, you grab those teeth, you run back to your house, you die, you die.
You dive back into your house head first through a different window, you cut yourself up badly again, you get inside your kitchen and you whip together a wallaby teeth salad just in time as your guests are coming in the door and right before you pass out from blood loss. Crisis averted, right? Wrong. Zebra cornea souffle and wallaby teeth salad, they're not good. But what is good is HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal service that delivers actually good tasting food right to your doorstep. Between menu items like cheese stuffed burgers and grilled salmon with balsamic tomatoes, you are not only going to wow your barbecue guests, but also you're going to avoid jail time for poaching wallabies and zebras, and you're going to avoid expensive medical and repair bills from all the jumping out the windows you were doing. HelloFresh recipes include pre-portioned ingredients, which means less prep time and less wasted food. HelloFresh also offers a line of kid-friendly recipes that are perfect for families that are looking to try something new as the summer winds down and we get ready for school to start up again. So, if you're ready to stop choking down zebra corneas and wallaby teeth, then you need to sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code Mrballen16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code Mrballen16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Okay, back to the story. There is an international organization called Mensa. That's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% out of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived, in Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, that Mensa chapter, what they would do is they would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role play a murder investigation. So one or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. And so once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. And so this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with 2 very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter. And they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Trapal. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida, and George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And, critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Diana and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself, she's moved to a brand new area, she's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends, and so she probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could, and George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could, and he was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. And so they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards, they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character, and everyone's also looking at this so-called perfect crime that George had come up with, that he was also very proud about, and he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. And she would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon, and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body, and how you can get it, and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. And so that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great, and they would head home. And then over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart, that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida, and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry, and so they said, "You know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not. And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car, and as soon as they had drove off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things and she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. And so before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time, around the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning. And one of the symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning, but the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys are lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs. Way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do. Your body is basically already dead. You're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family has been poisoned, and so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick, and so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company, and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day and there was this typed out note that said, your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or you're all gonna die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police have ruled Pi out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gilek, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her in to the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friends and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious. They were too noisy. They were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than Dr. Carr, she had gotten into at least one or two serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pi and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pi, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pi and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pi and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pi reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle topping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a topping machine at his house. And so with his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pi and her family were out of their house. And then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on the kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook. And then he left the house, and that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend, the murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning? And how'd you learn about poisoning? And what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. and so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house, they searched it top to bottom, and in the garage they found George's chemistry equipment, and nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive and he is still on death row. As for his wife Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything, and so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry. So